Hi Year 12s. Today we're going to be looking at the third PowerPoint in the homeostasis topic. For this PowerPoint we're going to be looking at two different videos. The first is going to be the endocrine system in general, and the second is going to be the regulation of the body via hormones. So first off, let's delve into the endocrine system. As per usual, there's a need to know.
Every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain.
We're not going to go through the need to know, so if you'd like to pause the video here and write all of the need to knows down, you can. Moving on though. So, the endocrine system. What exactly is the endocrine system? Well, the endocrine system is made up of special glands in your body that secrete hormones into the circulatory system, so secreting hormones into the blood. The reason for that is that the circulatory system can transport those hormones around the entire body, which allow the hormones to reach the organs and cells that are quite far away from where the hormones actually secreted, so they can travel long distances through the circulatory system. The important thing to know about hormones is they are specific, which means they all have specific receptors and only a specific hormone will bind with that specific receptor. That means that a hormone can target a specific cell. In order for the hormone to have an effect on that cell, the cell must have the correct receptor for the hormone that has been released. Over here we have just a little bit of a diagram of all the different glands in the endocrine system that are responsible for secreting hormones. Again, might be worth pausing and taking a note of this diagram down. So what exactly do hormones do? So different hormones obviously have different effects on a target cell. It all depends on what hormone's actually been released. The effect that a hormone's actually going to have on that cell will depend on the physical properties of that hormone, such as the size of the hormone or the solubility of the hormone, etc. When the hormone does bind with the receptor though, it forms something called the receptor hormone complex, and that's when you start to see effects in the cell. So we've got two examples we're going to look at. The first one is a steroid hormone. Now steroid hormones are soluble in lipids, which means they can freely diffuse across the cell membrane. That means since they can cross the cell membrane, the receptor can actually be inside the cell itself, and they're actually often found inside the nucleus of that target cell. So the steroid hormone moves into the cell and then into the nucleus, where it forms a receptor hormone complex. Once it does that, it binds to DNA, and when it binds to DNA, it initiates the transcription of a specific gene. So over here we have an example of a hormone that is soluble in lipids and hence can move across the cell membrane and the nuclear membrane. Our second example over here, the peptide hormones, they're hydrophilic, and consequently they can't diffuse across the cell membrane. Okay. Instead, that means they have to bind with receptors that are on the surface of the cell rather than binding inside the cell in the nucleus like we saw in the first example. Again, the hormone will form a receptor hormone complex with the receptor on the outside of the cell, which will initiate intracellular reactions occurring inside the cell, which eventually will change the activity of that cell by activating specific enzymes, and overall, again, will alter gene expression. Glycogen. So we're going to look at quite a bit at glycogen and glucose and glucogenesis, etc. So this is a bit of a longer part of the topic. First off, what is glycogen? Well, glycogen is just a very large molecule in our body that's actually created from glucose. It's what we use to store glucose when we have too much of it, and that's a process that happens in animals, fungi, and bacteria. So when the blood glucose level in someone's body is high, glycogen will be created from the extra glucose, and when the blood concentration is lower again, it's going to be broken down to release glucose. Now, when that's going to generally happen, so for example, when you just eat dinner, for example, you've got a lot of glucose in your body because you've just taken in all of the energy-rich molecules in that food. So shortly after eating, all that excess glucose is going to be turned into glycogen in a process called glycogenesis. Whereas if I say I've eaten breakfast and then I've gone without lunch today, or I've even up to lunch, I've eaten breakfast at 6 o'clock in the morning, by about 10 o'clock I've run out of glucose. My body's used up all that glucose that was left over for my body to use, and I haven't put any more glucose into my body. So then we'll have a process called glycogenolysis, where the stored glucose as glycogen is actually broken down and released into our bodies again for use. So it's, like I said, glycogen is just a storage for glucose for when your body needs it. In humans, glycogen is often created, stored, and broken down inside our muscles, which is about 80% of the time, and then also in the liver, which is the last 20% of the time. Gluconeogenesis is another different term we're looking at here. So gluconeogenesis is a metabolic pathway in our bodies that actually creates glucose from smaller compounds like amino acids and glycerol. Gluconeogenesis is a process that we use as humans to keep our blood glucose levels within that tolerance range. So if we haven't eaten much glucose for a while, we could create some through gluconeogenesis. How do we regulate blood glucose in the body, though? We've talked about the fact that we have very narrow tolerance ranges for blood glucose. Therefore, we have to regulate it really tightly to keep it in those tolerance ranges. So whenever blood glucose levels move outside of the tolerance range, it's detected by specialized cells inside our pancreas. These cells are called the islets of Langerhans, and they'll release insulin and glucagon depending on what the situation is. Whatever it is, insulin or glucagon will actually bring the blood glucose levels back into the range of the tolerance limits of our human body. Again, this occurs through negative feedback, like I said last week. Most things in our body, except for the one that we talked about, are going to be done through negative feedback. So what do these do? What does insulin and glucagon actually do? Well, insulin is secreted by beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, and when they're only secreted when your blood glucose concentration is high. And what they'll do, is decrease the blood glucose concentration in the body. Glucagon, on the other hand, is released from the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans, and they'll be secreted when the blood glucose concentration is low. Their job is to increase the blood glucose concentration, and we're going to talk about how they do this on this slide here. So insulin and glucagon. Insulin stimulates the cells in our muscles, liver, and fat tissue to absorb glucose from the blood. It's telling us to stop creating more glucose. We want to take the glucose away. So it's going to stimulate glycogenesis to store that glucose as glycogen. Turn all the excess glucose into glycogen. We don't need it. It stops gluconeogenesis from using amino acids to create and glycerol to create glucose because we don't need it. We've got enough in our body. So it stops gluconeogenesis. It also stops glycogenolysis. We don't need to break down any more glycogen because we've got enough glucose. We need to be building up glycogen. Glucagon does the opposite. It stimulates the cells in your muscles, liver, and fat to release glucose into the blood. It stimulates glycogenolysis to break down glycogen into glucose that our body can use to create energy through aerobic respiration. It stimulates gluconeogenesis to increase the production of glucose from glycerol and amino acids. We want more glucose being made. What it does stop is glycogenesis. We don't want that glucose being stored as glycogen. We need it now. So that's how insulin and glucagon work. Diabetes mellitus. So diabetes is a group of disorders that are related to high blood glucose levels. Anyone that has diabetes, known as a diabetic, generally doesn't have the ability to release enough insulin, which means they can't control blood glucose levels and they often rise above the tolerance limits. So there's a number of symptoms that these people have. So one of those symptoms is hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia is the increase in blood glucose concentration above the tolerance limit. They might also have glucosuria, which is high levels of glucose excreted in urine, which leads to polyuria, which means excessive urination. Because they're excessively urinating, they have polydipsia, which increases the thirst to replace the water lost through urination. And then they also have polyphagia. Because they're losing so much glucose in their urine, they need to replace that by eating more glucose and building up the amount of glucose in their body. So these are the symptoms that diabetics will often show when they've got diabetes. There's different types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. There's also gestational, which we'll talk about very slowly. So type 1 is generally the one that you're born with. So that happens because your beta cells are repeatedly destroyed by the immune system. Hence, you can't produce any insulin in the islets of Langerhans, which means that there's less insulin secreted throughout a person's entire life. Whereas type 2 diabetes is the one that generally people gain throughout their lifetime through excessive eating of sugary substances, etc. And in this one, body cells actually become resistant to the effect of insulin because they're seeing it so much. That means that we prevent the transport of glucose into cells for respiration, results in the accumulation of glucose into the blood. Gestational diabetes, that's when the body cells have reduced response to insulin because someone is pregnant, hence the name gestational. How can we treat diabetes? Well, truthfully, at the moment, there is no cure for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but both of those disorders can be managed through various treatments. We can't cure them, but we can help people manage them. Type 1 diabetes is generally managed by the injection of insulin. There's two types of insulin. There's basal insulin and bolus insulin. Basal insulin is injected once a day and is absorbed very slowly into the body, whereas bolus insulin is injected only at meal times to combat the food that's being eaten there and then. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, can be managed by lifestyle changes, such as changing your diet, exercising more frequently, using different medications, or with insulin injections as well.
Don't you hate to be continueds on TV? It's horrible when you sense the to be continued coming. You know, you're watching the show, you're into the story, and then there's like 5 minutes left, and suddenly you realize, hey, they can't make it. Timmy's still stuck in the cave. There's no way they wrap this up in 5 minutes.